wins this case, that kind of goes away, right? The president has a lot more authority over those agencies, and it might not even be the end of it. There might be more things to come that will make them further under the control of the president and less likely to be protected from those issues of the day.
To be clear, the court has not decided yet. They'll make that decision down the road, but you can often get a sense of things from the oral arguments. Certainly not unanimous the way this went today. We heard from some of the more liberal justices too, right? That's right. The liberal justices, as they have been in quite a few cases recently, are kind of in the position of sort of defending the status quo, right? That's been around for 90 years, as you mentioned. And so they're saying, like, Congress wanted to have experts running these agencies, you know, people who really understood the kind of nitty-gritty of these issues. And we can hear Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson kind of make that point during the argument today.
Having a president come in and fire all the scientists and the doctors and the economists and the PhDs and replacing them with loyalists and people who don't know.
There it is again, that sickening feeling in the pit of your stomach when you realize the architecture of American democracy is being dismantled brick by brick in real time, and the people doing it have the audacity to call it accountability, have the gall to wrap their authoritarian project in the language of constitutional originalism, while they systematically dismantle 90 years of carefully constructed guardrails against executive tyranny. You just heard Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson warning with crystalline clarity what's about to happen, describing a president who could fire all the scientists and the doctors and the economists and the PhDs and replacing them with loyalists and people who don't know anything. And you need to understand something absolutely fundamental about this moment, because what happened in that Supreme Court chamber yesterday is not just another case about administrative law or separation of powers. It's the final act in a decades-long conservative legal project to concentrate unfettered power in the executive branch and obliterate the very concept of independent expertise in government. And here's the thing that should terrify you beyond measure. All 6 of the Supreme Court's conservative justices indicated during oral arguments that a president should have absolute control over the leadership of any government body carrying out executive functions, which means this isn't speculation or fear-mongering. This is the roadmap they're openly announcing while they appear likely to roll back 90 years of legal precedent in a decision that would expand presidential power and could transform the federal government and effectively end the independence of some 24 bipartisan agencies that Congress had designed to be insulated from political interference. Let me take you back to what this precedent actually represents, because understanding Humphrey's executor isn't just constitutional history trivia, it's understanding the entire New Deal settlement and the architecture of modern regulatory governance. The court was dealing with an FTC member who was fired by President Franklin Roosevelt in 1935, and the justices unanimously upheld the law establishing the FTC and limiting the president to removing a commissioner only for inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance in office. This wasn't some power grab by unelected bureaucrats. This was Congress making a deliberate choice after decades of Gilded Age excess and corporate predation that maybe, just maybe, we needed regulatory agencies that could operate based on evidence and expertise, rather than the political whims of whoever occupied the White House for 4 years, that perhaps consumer protection and fair competition and workplace safety shouldn't be subject to the pendulum swings of electoral politics. And what followed from that decision was extraordinary. An era of powerful independent federal agencies charged with regulating labor relations, employment discrimination, the airwaves, and much more, the entire infrastructure that gave us clean water and safe food, and financial markets that didn't collapse every generation, and broadcast standards and fair labor practices, the unglamorous but absolutely essential machinery of a functioning modern state. But here's what you need to grasp about the conservative legal movement's obsession with destroying this framework, and this gets to the heart of why the unitary executive theory is so insidious and so revelatory about what they actually want. Humphrey's executor has long been a target of the conservative legal movement that has embraced an expansive view of presidential power known as the unitary executive, and since the Reagan administration, the U.S. Supreme Court has embraced a stronger unitary executive, which has been championed primarily by its conservative justices, the Federalist Society, and the Heritage Foundation. This isn't random. This isn't just abstract constitutional theorizing. This is a deliberate project by conservative donors and right-wing legal organizations that understand something crucial, that if you want to dismantle the regulatory state, if you want to return to an era where corporations can operate with impunity and workers have no protections, and the environment is just another externality to be exploited, you can't just win elections and pass laws, because Congress created these agencies with independence precisely to prevent that kind of wholesale demolition. No, what you need is a constitutional theory that says the whole structure was illegitimate from the start, that says the president must have total control over every single person in the executive branch, that transforms the careful balance of powers into a unitary hierarchy with one person at the top, issuing commands like a CEO running a private company. And the timing of this case, coming right now in December 2025, is absolutely crucial to understanding what's at stake, because this isn't hypothetical anymore. In March, Slaughter received an email from the White House Office of Presidential Personnel informing her that she was being removed from office, effective immediately, told her continued service on the FTC is inconsistent with the Trump administration's priorities. Rebecca Kelly Slaughter, understand, was appointed by Trump himself during his first term to fill a Democratic seat on the FTC. She's not some Obama holdover or resistance figure. She's a legal scholar who was serving her statutory term on a bipartisan commission, and Trump fired her purely because she was a Democrat, whose continued service was inconvenient to his agenda. Since January, Trump has also removed Democratic members from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the Merit Systems Protection Board, and the Consumer Product Safety Commission. And when lower courts tried to block these firings, justices voted 6-3 along ideological lines to allow her firing to stand, for now, which means the Supreme Court already showed its hand before the oral arguments even happened, already telegraphed that the 6 conservative justices are prepared to give Trump exactly what he wants. Now listen to what was said in that courtroom, because the contrast between the 3 liberal justices and the 6 conservative justices isn't just a disagreement about constitutional interpretation, it's a chasm between 2 fundamentally different visions of American governance. Justice Sonia Sotomayor told Trump administration Solicitor General John Sauer, "You're asking us to destroy the structure of government," which is not hyperbole. That's an accurate description of what overturning Humphrey's executor would accomplish. Justice Elena Kagan said she worried about a slippery slope, warning that the result of what you want is that the president is going to have massive, unchecked, uncontrolled power, not only to do traditional execution of the laws, but to make law. And she's absolutely right, because if the president controls every single person in every regulatory agency, then the president effectively controls all rulemaking, all enforcement, all interpretation of statutes, which means the massive regulatory apparatus that governs everything from drug safety to airline standards to securities fraud is no longer accountable to law or evidence or expertise, but purely to the political preferences of one elected official and whoever they appoint as loyalists. And Justice Jackson's warning that you heard in that clip needs to be understood not as partisan rhetoric, but as a precise description of the Trump administration's actual agenda that's already underway. Because while the Supreme Court is debating whether Trump will have the authority to purge independent agencies of experts, Trump has already been conducting a massive purge of scientists and researchers across the federal government, and the scale of this is genuinely breathtaking. Nearly 400 scientists across the United States were informed Monday afternoon that their services were no longer needed to help write a major report on climate change for the federal government, the National Climate Assessment, which is a major publication produced every 4 years that summarizes the impacts of climate change in the United States and is congressionally mandated. These aren't political appointees. These are the nation's leading climate scientists who were volunteering their expertise to fulfill a congressional mandate, and the Trump administration just fired all of them because their expertise contradicts the administration's ideological commitments. The Trump administration has refired hundreds of probationary workers at NOAA after a court ruling cleared the way, workers who were first terminated in February, but reinstated after a federal court blocked the move in March. And among those fired were specialists working to track El Niño and La Niña, understand the risks from severe storms, and forecast the future impact of climate change. The Environmental Protection Agency is being systematically gutted of scientific capacity in ways that will take generations to rebuild. The Trump administration announced it was eliminating the Office of Research and Development and firing hundreds of scientists, an office that for decades has led the way in protecting Americans from dangerous pollutants, making our air cleaner, our lives longer, and our children healthier. The firings would result from the EPA eliminating its scientific research arm that employs over 1,500 people, which means the agency responsible for understanding pollution and setting safety standards and protecting public health will no longer have the in-house scientific expertise to do any of those things, will be dependent entirely on whatever industry-funded studies and political appointees tell them. And let's be absolutely clear about what's happening here. Some EPA workers have been fired for their involvement in speaking up for science, while many others are still on administrative leave, while being investigated for this purported misconduct, meaning they have not been able to do their jobs for weeks, and these actions are prime examples of political retaliation. The National Institutes of Health, the crown jewel of American biomedical research that has driven more medical breakthroughs than any other institution in human history, is being dismantled in real time. The Trump administration has thrown out hundreds of National Institutes of Health research projects, fired thousands of the agency's scientists, and looks intent on further dismantling the agency, and the consequences of this are already catastrophic. The Trump administration is waging a wholesale assault on U.S. science that threatens the country's health, economic development, national security, and scientific preeminence, according to an open letter published by nearly 2,000 doctors, scientists, and researchers. In France, Aix-Marseille University has received nearly 300 applications from Americans for its Safe Place for Science program, as Europe saw many scientists flee for the U.S. during World War II, and it now appears that experts are starting to flow in the opposite direction, with experts saying, "I never thought I would live in a country where I would see scientists basically seeking asylum." Let that sink in for a moment, because we're not talking about metaphorical asylum. We're talking about American scientists literally fleeing the country because they can no longer do their work here, because the political environment has become so hostile to evidence and expertise that they're seeking refuge in Europe. This is what happens when you destroy the independence of scientific agencies, when you turn every researcher and every study and every finding into a political loyalty test, when expertise itself becomes suspect and the only qualification that matters is fealty to whatever the president wants to hear. And the conservative justice's response to all this, Solicitor General Sauer replied, "The sky will not fall. The entire government will move toward accountability to the people," which is such a perverse inversion of what accountability actually means that it would be laughable if it weren't so dangerous. Few of the conservatives seemed concerned about the consequences, with Alito asking Sauer, "It's been suggested if we rule for you, the entire government will fall," to which Sauer replied, "The sky will not fall. In fact, the entire government will live with accountability." This is the language of authoritarianism dressed up as democratic accountability, the idea that the only legitimate form of control is direct hierarchical control by one elected official, that Congress's judgments about how to structure agencies are somehow less democratic than presidential fiat, that career scientists and economists and doctors who've spent their lives developing expertise are somehow unaccountable compared to political appointees who got their jobs by writing checks to the campaign or pledging personal loyalty. Let me explain why this framing is not just wrong, but deliberately misleading, because it gets to the heart of what the unitary executive theory actually does. Jackson asked Sauer why Congress is somehow less democratically accountable for the way in which it constructs these agencies and determines the term of office of the officers, and Sauer told her that what it lacks authority to do is to create these headless agencies who have no boss and are not answerable to the voters. But this is a complete fabrication of how these agencies actually work. They're not headless. They're structured with bipartisan commissions precisely to ensure they answer to law and evidence rather than partisan politics. They're accountable to Congress, which created them and funds them and can change their mandates at any time. They're accountable to the courts, which can overturn their actions if they exceed statutory authority or act arbitrarily. What they're not accountable to is the unilateral whim of the president, which is exactly the point, which is exactly why Congress structured them this way. Because sometimes you want regulators who can enforce securities laws against the president's donors, or investigate workplace safety violations at companies the president likes, or set environmental standards that the president finds inconvenient. And Chief Justice Roberts showed his hand completely when he referred to Humphrey's executor as a dried husk during 2.5 hours of oral arguments, and said the FTC today is significantly more powerful than it was in the 1990s, which is such a nakedly results-oriented piece of reasoning that it abandons any pretense of judicial neutrality. Of course, the FTC is more powerful now than in 1935. The economy is vastly more complex. Corporate power is vastly more concentrated. The potential for consumer harm is vastly greater. That's precisely why we need independent agencies with real enforcement power, not agencies that can be defanged the moment a president decides that consumer protection or antitrust enforcement conflicts with his political interests. In 2020, Roberts wrote for the court that the president's removal power is the rule, not the exception. In a decision upholding Trump's firing of the head of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and in the 2024 immunity decision that spared Trump from being prosecuted for his efforts to overturn the 2020 election results, Roberts included the power to fire among the president's conclusive and preclusive powers that Congress lacks the authority to restrict. which means Roberts has been building toward this outcome for years, systematically laying the groundwork for concentrating power in the presidency in ways that would have been unthinkable even a generation ago. The broader context here is absolutely essential because this case doesn't exist in isolation. It's part of a coordinated assault on the entire administrative state from multiple directions simultaneously. The Supreme Court already overturned Chevron deference this year, eliminating 40 years of precedent that gave agencies expertise-based deference in interpreting ambiguous statutes, which means courts rather than scientists and economists now get to make technical judgments about everything from air quality standards to financial regulations. They're poised to overturn Humphrey's executor, which will eliminate agency independence and subject every regulator to presidential political control. And meanwhile, Chief Justice John Roberts has led the Supreme Court's conservative majority on a steady march of increasing the power of the presidency, starting well before Donald Trump's time in the White House, systematically building an infrastructure of presidential supremacy that Trump is now exploiting with devastating effectiveness. Think about what this means in practice. Think about the concrete real-world implications of what they're building. Trump wants to fire the scientists who tell him that his tariffs will harm the economy, so he fires them and replaces them with loyalists who'll produce studies saying whatever he wants. He wants to fire the doctors who tell him that his health policies will increase mortality, so he fires them and installs yes-men who'll rubber stamp whatever RFK Jr. dreams up. He wants to fire the economists at the Federal Trade Commission who are investigating monopolistic practices by companies whose CEOs donated to his campaign, so he fires them and the investigations disappear. Trump fired Slaughter and the other Democrat on the FTC in March, opening the door for the Republican to appoint loyalists at the agency, and the outcome in the Slaughter case will determine whether or not there will be any Democrats left on the FTC or other regulatory bodies, and whether any of the other independent agencies will be truly independent any longer. The historical parallel here is so obvious that it's almost painful to state, but it needs to be said because Americans have this dangerous tendency to think authoritarianism can't happen here, that our institutions are too strong, that the Constitution protects us. But the Constitution is just words on paper. It means whatever the Supreme Court says it means, and the Supreme Court is currently controlled by 6 conservative justices who are systematically dismantling the structural protections that made American democracy resilient. They called this the unitary executive theory, which is a fancy way of saying that a chief executive can rule over the executive branch like a monarch, meaning every one of its millions of employees serves at the president's beck and call. Every authoritarian movement claims to be restoring accountability and eliminating unelected bureaucrats and letting the people's voice be heard through their elected leader. That's the playbook. That's always the playbook. And it always ends with the destruction of the independent institutions that constrain executive power, and the consolidation of authority in one person who claims to embody the popular will. And here's what makes this moment so particularly dangerous, so uniquely threatening. Trump isn't hiding what he's doing. He's not even bothering with plausible deniability or constitutional cover. Under this new employment classification, if President Trump doesn't like the findings of federal research, a new science-based rule, or even the scientific information a federal agency shares with the public, he can simply fire the scientists or policy analysts behind the work. And this job reclassification creates an incentive for scientists to conduct studies that are biased in favor of the outcome the president wants, and pressures experts into issuing rules the president favors, very likely those deemed acceptable by, or that would benefit industry, even if the rules do not comport with fact, or the latest science. This is the open politicization of science, the explicit subordination of evidence to power, and it's happening with the Supreme Court's blessing, with the active encouragement of 6 justices who apparently believe that presidential accountability is more important than having a government that operates based on facts. The intellectual dishonesty of the conservative position here is genuinely staggering when you examine it closely. They claim to be originalists, to care about what the founders intended, to want to restore the Constitution's original meaning. According to legal historians and even a prominent proponent of the originalism approach to interpreting the Constitution that is favored by conservatives, Roberts may be wrong about the history underpinning the unitary executive, with University of Virginia law professor Caleb Nelson, who once served as a law clerk to Justice Clarence Thomas, writing both the text and the history of Article 2 are far more equivocal than the current court has been suggesting. The founders explicitly rejected monarchy. They created a system of checks and balances precisely to prevent the concentration of power, and they gave Congress broad authority to structure the executive branch however it saw fit. The idea that the Constitution requires presidential control over every single executive officer regardless of what Congress says is not originalism, it's activism in service of an ideological agenda. It's making up constitutional requirements that don't exist to justify a predetermined outcome. But here's the thing that should make you absolutely furious, that should galvanize you to action rather than despair. The conservative justices keep claiming this is about democratic accountability and popular sovereignty, that the president should have this power because the president is elected and accountable to the people. But independent agencies have regulated American monetary policy and stock trades, transportation systems and election campaigns, consumer product safety and broadcast licenses historically overseen by subject matter experts from both parties. And these agencies exist precisely because the American people, through their elected representatives in Congress, decided that certain functions should be insulated from day-to-day politics, that you don't want your retirement savings subject to the whims of whoever the president wants to appoint to the SEC based on campaign donations, that you don't want the safety of your drinking water determined by whether the president feels like enforcing the Clean Water Act today. Congress made those choices. Congress is elected. Congress is accountable. And when the Supreme Court overturns those choices in the name of presidential accountability, they're not restoring democracy. They're substituting their own policy preferences for those of the democratically elected legislature. And we need to talk about what's being destroyed here, in terms of actual governance capacity, because the wonky details of administrative law matter enormously to people's lives. Between January 20th and August 31st, 2025, there have been 479 attacks on science, actions, decisions, or policies that undermine, co-opt, or blatantly ignore science in the federal government. And each one of those attacks represents something concrete: a cancer study that won't get funded, a pollution standard that won't get enforced, a climate model that won't get built, a vaccine recommendation that gets politicized, a workplace safety inspection that doesn't happen. The very top scientists, the top minds in our country and in our government, who have the expertise for doing this research, are being pushed out and being replaced by individuals who have more of a commitment to the ideological and partisan agenda of the administration, and Americans are not necessarily getting the straight facts about what the science tells us, because it's very important for Americans to be able to receive the truth about what the evidence tells us, and not have to worry whether it's being slanted to suit politics or special interests. The economic argument against this is overwhelming, and conservatives are either ignorant of it or deliberately ignoring it because it contradicts their narrative. Investing in basic science often generates more money than it costs, with every dollar spent on NIH research resulting in about 2.50 worth of economic growth, and around 90% of FDA-approved new drugs started out with NIH support. When you destroy the NIH, when you gut the EPA's research capacity, when you fire hundreds of NOAA scientists, you're not just making government smaller, you're destroying the infrastructure that generates economic growth and technological innovation and solutions to collective action problems that markets alone cannot solve. And the rest of the world is watching this with a mixture of horror and opportunism, because American scientific preeminence has been the foundation of American power for a century, and when you drive scientists into exile, when you make it impossible for researchers to do their work without political interference, that preeminence evaporates, and it doesn't come back just because you decide a few years later that maybe science was important after all. The Supreme Court is going to rule against slaughter. Let's be absolutely clear about that. The outcome of Monday's oral arguments has been fairly clear since the summer, when the court indicated Humphrey's executor, a unanimous 1935 decision upholding Congress's power to restrict the president's ability to fire independent agency heads, is going to be overturned. The 6 conservative justices are going to hand Trump exactly what he wants. They're going to tell him he has constitutional authority to fire anyone in the executive branch for any reason or no reason. They're going to eliminate the last remaining structural checks on presidential control over the regulatory state. And they're going to do it while claiming to be faithful to the Constitution and promoting democratic accountability and restoring the founders' vision, and it will be one of the most destructive Supreme Court decisions in American history, precisely because it will make so many other destructive actions possible. Because understand what follows once this decision comes down, probably sometime next summer when the Supreme Court term ends. A ruling for Trump would mark one of the most significant shifts in presidential power in modern history, curtailing protections for dozens of federal agencies that regulate everything from Wall Street to environmental standards. And Trump will use that power immediately and ruthlessly. Every Democrat on every independent commission gets fired and replaced with a loyalist. The NLRB stops protecting workers' rights to organize. The FTC stops pursuing antitrust cases against Trump's corporate allies. The SEC stops investigating securities fraud by companies whose executives donate to Republican campaigns. The CPSC stops recalling dangerous products made by companies that Trump likes. The Federal Reserve, if the Supreme Court extends its logic there, loses its independence and becomes a tool of presidential economic management, with interest rates set based on election cycles rather than economic conditions. And every single regulatory action, every rule, every enforcement decision becomes subject to political calculation about whether it serves the president's interests, which means the law stops being the law and becomes whatever the president says it is on any given day. The three liberal justices understand this completely, which is why their dissents in these cases have become increasingly urgent, increasingly explicit about what's happening. Liberal justices pushed back against the Trump administration's argument that the executive possesses the authority to fire officials at will, with Justice Sonia Sotomayor telling Solicitor General Sauer, "You're asking us to destroy the structure of government and to take away from Congress its ability to protect its idea that the government is better structured with some agencies that are independent." But they're writing for history at this point. They're writing for a future Supreme Court that might someday restore what's being destroyed, because they can't win these cases. They're outvoted 6-3 on every major question of presidential power, and the conservative majority is not interested in persuasion or precedent or institutional legitimacy. They're interested in results, in using their power while they have it to lock in conservative policy preferences through constitutional interpretation that will be very difficult to undo. So what do we do? What is the response to watching the Supreme Court actively participate in the construction of an imperial presidency while claiming to be restoring constitutional order? First, we name what's happening with absolute clarity. We refuse to let this be normalized or treated as ordinary legal interpretation. We call it what it is, which is the systematic dismantling of democratic safeguards and the concentration of authoritarian power. Second, we recognize that the Supreme Court has become a partisan actor rather than a neutral arbiter, that the Roberts Court's legacy will be enabling democratic backsliding in service of conservative policy goals, and we plan accordingly for a future where the court cannot be trusted to defend democracy or rights or the rule of law. Third, we fight like hell in every other arena. We support the litigation that challenges Trump's abuses, even knowing the Supreme Court may ultimately side with him. We pressure Congress to use its oversight and appropriations power to constrain executive abuses. We build state-level resistance. We support the scientists and researchers who are speaking out and organizing and trying to preserve some space for evidence-based policymaking. We make it politically costly for Republicans to support this wholesale destruction of governance capacity. And fourth, most importantly, we understand that this is not sustainable, that you cannot run a modern state on loyalty and ideology instead of expertise and evidence, that the consequences of these decisions will become undeniable when the next pandemic hits and we've gutted the public health infrastructure, when the next financial crisis hits and we've eliminated independent regulatory oversight, when the climate disasters intensify and we've fired all the scientists who could help us understand and prepare for what's coming. The Trump administration and the conservative Supreme Court are building a system that will fail catastrophically, and when it does, we need to be ready with an alternative vision, with a plan to rebuild independent institutions with stronger protections, to enshrine expertise and evidence back into governance, to restore the understanding that some things should be decided based on facts rather than politics, that democratic accountability doesn't mean presidential domination of every function of government, but rather a complex system of overlapping authorities and checks and balances that prevent any single actor from wielding unchecked power. This Supreme Court case about firing an FTC commissioner is about all of that, about whether we're going to preserve any meaningful constraints on executive power, or whether we're going to concentrate authority in a unitary executive who can purge anyone who dares to challenge them with facts or expertise or adherence to law, rather than loyalty. Justice Jackson warned exactly what's coming. She told us plainly that we're heading toward a government where having a president come in and fire all the scientists and the doctors and the economists and the PhDs and replacing them with loyalists and people who don't know anything is actually not in the best interest of the citizens of the United States. And this is what Congress's policy decision is when it says that these certain agencies we're not going to make directly accountable to the president. And the conservative majority is going to ignore that warning. They're going to give Trump the power he wants. And then we're going to find out the hard way what happens when you destroy expertise and independence and accountability in favor of loyalty and power and presidential supremacy, and by the time we learn that lesson, it may be too late to undo the damage, which is why we have to fight it now, have to resist it at every level, have to make absolutely clear that we see what they're doing, and we will not let it be normalized or accepted or treated as anything other than what it is, which is the destruction of democratic governance in the name of saving it, the elimination of expertise in the name of accountability, the concentration of power in the name of the people, all the classic moves of authoritarian consolidation, dressed up in constitutional language and blessed by a Supreme Court that has abandoned its role as guardian of the constitutional order and become instead an enabler of its dismantling.